Hello, my name is Gavin, and today I'm here to ask a question that nobody is asking. Is nuclear renewable? When people think about renewables, they generally think of wind and solar, and perhaps even hydro or geothermal. Wind and solar, in the popular imagination, have a feeling of being clean technologies. It's certainly true that the sun provides a long-term source of power, and by consequence wind power as well. Unfortunately, it is largely a feeling that constitutes renewable in the imagination. The fuel that goes into renewable power sources is only part of the equation. Can we be more scientific about our notion of renewable? We want processes for generating power that are sustainable over the long term. We should be able to generate sufficient power for humanity for as far as we hope to go. And this requires attention to the consequences, land use, waste, etc. Not only that, but also the emissions that are produced during power production. But power production facilities themselves also require mining and manufacture, and that has to be part of the equation. And finally, the decommissioning of these sources when they're no longer able to generate power sustainably has to be, again, part of the equation. Importantly, disposal of these facilities at the end of their life is a major factor, especially with diffuse power sources such as solar and wind. When viewed in this light, the choices presented to us for power production become less straightforward. Renewable becomes a much more complicated question. In this image here, you see that there are a lot of factors going into the construction of photovoltaic uh, sources of power. So we have energy produced by the sun and solar radiation going into the operational phase. But there's many other parts of this. There's the production of the photovoltaic cells in manufacturing, fabrication of those PV modules. We have the materials that are required. That involves steel, glass, aluminium, and cement in very large quantities, but also rare earth metals and various kinds of toxic inputs. We then construct those collectors for photovoltaic power, and after the operational phase, which can take, say, 15 years, we then have a decommissioning phase, and we have to take those used products and do either metal recycling, etc., or waste disposal of those products which can't be reused in some kind of realistic way. During this period of construction, there's also a large number of greenhouse gases that are released because of the manufacturing technologies themselves. Not all of it can be driven by electricity at the present moment, and much of the electricity that is currently produced is done in such a way that it generates greenhouse gases. Now, this is true of every kind of manufacturing that we have at the moment because we don't have net zero carbon emission technologies for much of manufacturing. So, first, how is it that we can expect to be able to run nuclear given that it's unlike power and wind and it requires fuel? Using commercially available reactors, those kinds of reactors that are pictured here, we would, if we scaled up to entire world energy production needs, using primarily nuclear power, we could expect to get about 100 to 200 years out of known uranium reserves. Clearly, this does not constitute a long-term power source. It's perhaps more sustainable than natural gas or coal. It would release very little CO2 compared to these other sources. However, 100 to 200 years is not a civilization scale. It's not something that we could imagine doing in perpetuity. Some CO2 sources are required at present in order to construct a nuclear power plant. For instance, the construction of concrete, the manufacture of concrete requires CO2 at present because we need very high temperatures, and these high temperature sources generally require the burning of coal or natural gas in order to produce them. Now, this isn't a lone factor in nuclear power construction. This is also going to be true of things such as solar panels and wind turbines, as well as hydropower, which requires enormous amounts of concrete. Until we find ways of producing concrete without CO2 release, then we are going to be unable to completely overcome this hurdle. However, we can reduce the amount by reducing total concrete construction. Fast reactors, however, offer us an alternative to current light water reactors. Fast reactors allow much higher burnup of nuclear fuel than we presently get. At present, we use between 1 and 5% of the fuel that's placed in a reactor, generally towards that lower bound. The results from fuel becoming unusable in the reactor are due to material constraints and the introduction of something we call neutron poisons from the byproducts of fission reactions. Fast reactors use higher speed neutrons, which are able to convert fertile elements such as uranium-238, which is far more numerous than natural uranium ore, into plutonium-239, which is itself a fissile fuel and can be burned in a reactor. This conversion of fertile into fissile fuel is called breeding. The available energy is then increased dramatically. A typical fast reactor can get around 10 to 20% burn up, about 5 times higher, and between 5 and 10 times as much energy from the same uranium ore. By itself, this would expand the life of known reserves to between 500 and 2,000 years. However, there is also the possibility of reprocessing. The deterioration of the fuel as it transforms into other elements with the creation of neutron poisons are really the limiting factors in burnup. We can then subsequently extract the remaining usable material from the spent fuel. From between 80 and 90% of the spent fuel in a typical fast reactor can then be reused as fuel again. Now this serves a number of goals. Increasing the amount of burnable material extends the life of a kilogram of ore and reduces the mining requirements to 1/4 or 1/5 of what they currently are. Extracting the short-lived radioactive fission products means that we can reduce the life of waste substantially. So currently, almost all long-lived waste is actually potential fuel. The real side products that are not usable last only around 350 years. Long-lived wastes should go back into a fast reactor, and we should continually recycle this in a continuous fashion. All fuel, at full burnup, if we manage to use all of the fuel, we'd be talking about having a byproduct, a waste product, that lasts only 350 years before returning to the radioactive levels of the ore from which it was mined. So, how do we manage reprocessing? Currently, France reuses a significant portion of their fuel in their pressurized light water reactors. This reduces the fuel requirements substantially and generally reduces less CO2 release and less land use from mining than we find from other countries. However, a closed fuel cycle using multiple pass reprocessing with fast reactors would be desirable for both fuel use and waste stream management. The integral fast reactor, which was a concept developed in the United States, uses both continuous reprocessing and a fast reactor coupled with on-site reprocessing, and it realizes a closed fuel cycle. The Russians are currently building the Brest OD-300 reactor, a lead-cooled fast reactor, which will also have an on-site reprocessing facility to close the fuel cycle. These reactors are not purely conceptual. The reactor types, the sodium-cooled and lead-cooled fast reactors, have been demonstrated. The IFR in the United States had a demonstration facility in which they showed that this process is actually possible. However, going into the future, there are possibilities of more exotic continuous reprocessing potential. The reactor designs that do continuous online reprocessing of the fuel don't require that we have an external permanent on-site reprocessing. We simply take the fuel, move it through the reactor, and reprocess as we run the reactor. This is possible with liquid core reactors, such as the molten salt reactor design. So here we see an example of a molten salt reactor. It has on the outside a blanket, and the blanket absorbs neutrons that are coming out of the core. The core is where the fissile fuel load goes, and we put this into a configuration in which you have a large sphere, and that sphere then has high enough neutron flux to sustain a criticality event, allowing the neutrons then to move to the outer layer of thorium tetrafluoride, which then absorbs many of these neutrons, reducing the amount of radiation in the area, but also creating new fuel. This thorium then turns into uranium-233, and it can be burned in the reactor subsequently, after the removal of some neutron poisons. Continuous reprocessing looks feasible, and it's very desirable to simplify lots of aspects of the fuel cycle. But is 1,000 years enough? If we also increase energy use significantly, we're going to run into trouble. An expansion of world energy use to bring the poorer countries up to the level of Europe would mean at least a doubling or trebling of energy use. This could bring down the total reserves of uranium to something like 500 years, or perhaps even less. Fortunately, there is actually a lot of uranium in the ocean. We can extend the available supply of uranium to perhaps 1 billion years. As it currently stands, we don't extract uranium from the ocean because of the cost of doing so. Uranium is continuously replenished from the erosion of rocks, leading to the uranium content in the ocean being in equilibrium. So even if we extracted it at a very large rate, we could use it as the sole source of power for humanity for perhaps 1 billion years. Extraction of uranium from the ocean has already been demonstrated at a projected cost of around €200 per kilogram. Well, €200 per kilogram might sound like quite a lot. However, a typical German energy use is around 7,000 kilowatt hours per year. So in one lifetime, they use about 700,000 kilowatt hours, or about 30 megawatt days. This could sound like a lot, but current fuel costs for a nuclear power plant are about 1% of energy costs in a modern reactor. 1 kilogram of uranium in a closed fuel cycle is about itself 1 gigawatt days of power. That means that 1 kilogram of uranium will power 30 human lifetimes, yielding 1 kilogram of waste, lasting around 350 years. Total waste management would require about 1 million metric tons of short-lived waste to be managed in equilibrium, so for all of humanity, assuming a population of around 10 billion people, where we cycle out the waste every 350 years after it has sit until it reaches the background radiation levels. This is about the same as about 1,000 Olympic swimming pools of storage for all of humanity. Now that's not an unreasonable amount of space. To put this scale in perspective, we currently use around 900,000 million metric tons of coal a year. So this is a very manageable waste stream, a waste stream that eventually stops its toxicity and becomes something that you can safely Barry. So is nuclear renewable? It could be. Given the nearly inexhaustible fuel supply and the very small waste streams that it presents, we could feasibly deal on a civilization-based timescale with all of the waste and all of the fuel needs that we will have going into the future. Nuclear should be treated as a potentially renewable power technology that's actually superior to wind and solar. We probably will need fast reactors at minimum. We will also need reprocessing, and probably going into the future, continuous reprocessing will be the holy grail that makes this viable. Thank you.